Thank you. All right, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Thierry Vrain, to use my French accent, or Thierry Vrain, to Oak Park River Forest this evening. Dr. Vrain is a retired soil biologist and genetic engineer whose 25-year research career concentrated on genetic resistance to parasitic worms, among other things. He has authored and co-authored over 75 peer-reviewed studies, but since his retirement, he has become concerned about the excesses of industrial agriculture. He traveled from Vancouver Island, British Columbia, to join us this evening. Welcome, Dr. Vrain.
Thank you. Dr. Vasquez is from Buenos Aires in Argentina. In Argentina, in Chile, and in Brazil, they are planting a lot of GMO soybeans, and they spray the huge fields by plane, and people get sprayed. People in villages basically are completely living in a fog of this chemical, and they observe the medical establishment in these countries are really, really up in arms about what's happening. So this is the introduction. This is the chemical that I'm going to talk about. So the story is not so much about GMOs as it is basically a simple pesticide story. And I'm going to mix the two because people are concerned. People have been really concerned about GMOs and afraid of GMOs for at least 20, 30 years. When I used to work for the federal government in Canada, it was because I was a head of a department, it was my job. I considered it my job to speak to audiences, to reassure them that there was nothing wrong with GMOs. It's a safe technology. And I probably would say the same thing today. But when I started reading in my retirement papers that basically said that there was something terribly wrong, the rats were getting sick and dying, and I had to come up to some explanation. So that's why in the last 5 or 6 years, I have become public and I talk about this. So glyphosate is so prevalent in our environment because it is sprayed on our food crops. It is in our food. It is in the air, at least in the regions where it is used in agriculture, which is many, many places in the USA and in Canada. It is in the water, of course, and there are some maximum residue limits for the water, which are much higher here in North America than they are in Europe. And of course, it's everywhere, really. So we are completely exposed to this chemical. What is it? Well, it was invented in 1950. It's a completely new molecule. It's a tiny molecule. You're going to see it almost on all my slides in the corner, the right-hand corner. It was invented in 1950 as a synthetic amino acid. And the chemical company that synthesized it, among many other molecules, of course, just didn't really find a use for it, so they just put it on the shelf. And then there's a patent for it. It's used 14 years later. It is used as a demineralizer because it binds really avidly to many, many metal atoms, like copper and cobalt and iron, of course, and many others. So a demineralizer, and it has implications for its safety. And it's in 1969 that Monsanto patented it as a herbicide. So we have this new molecule which becomes a herbicide. And supposedly it works by inhibiting a biochemical pathway, a very short biochemical pathway, to make the amino acids, if you haven't forgotten your grade 8 or 10 or whatever number it should be, biology in high school, proteins are made, long chains made of little molecules called amino acids. And these 3 amino acids are made in this biochemical pathway in bacteria, in plants, and many other organisms, in fungi and most unicellular organisms with a nucleus to make their proteins. Animals, humans are animals, of course, we do not have that pathway. We do not make those amino acids. There are many other amino acids. Basically, there's about half of the amino acids that we have in our body that we do not know how to make. We do not have the biochemistry for that. So that's why we need to eat proteins every day. So animals do not have that pathway. So in theory, this chemical should not affect us at all because we don't have the biochemistry to be affected directly by this thing. And I'm going to, this is of course the argument that Monsanto put forward. Animals do not have that pathway, therefore they are completely insensitive to the chemical, and I'm going to show you otherwise. So glyphosate has been a really, really good, and is a really good herbicide. It basically kills all plants. And as I said, it is used everywhere as a herbicide to kill weeds. So if you kill the weeds like this, and then come a few weeks later, or possibly you do this in the fall and you plant your seeds in the spring, there will be some of the chemical residues in the soil that possibly will come up in the crop, in the food crop. Okay? So keep that in mind. 1996, there's I'm not sure, a very, very significant event. Monsanto invented GMOs, okay, genetically modified organism. Of course, they didn't invent GMOs, but they basically brought them to the fore. With a line of crops called Roundup Ready. Roundup Ready means that the plants were modified genetically to tolerate being sprayed with the herbicide Roundup. They are ready to be sprayed with Roundup. They are Roundup ready. It's not difficult to create GMOs. You use a small machine. It's about the size of a hairdryer. You shoot tiny little microscopic pellets of gold or platinum or something that cannot oxidize, on which you have stuck the little piece of DNA, the gene that you want to include into the plant. Okay, you're introducing a new gene into the plant. And you shoot those pellets into the tissue, into the leaves, and hoping that among the many millions of pellets that you're shooting, some of them will actually penetrate inside the cell, a cell, and into the nucleus, and hopefully the piece of DNA that you've stuck to the pellets will integrate into a genome, into a gene, into a chromosome of the plant. And when you have, with the gene that you stuck to the microscopic pellets, you put an antibiotic, which usually kanamycin, and therefore you can detect the cells that were transformed, genetically speaking, because they have both the gene that you wanted to introduce plus the gene for antibiotic resistance. And so you put antibiotic, kanamycin, into the Petri dish, and the cells that have been engineered will survive. Everything else will die. You have a few cells that were modified properly, and from those, from one cell, you can grow a whole plant. And from one plant, you can grow millions of acres. So this is how it's done. There are many different kinds of GMOs, and I'm just talking of the ones in agriculture because, of course, there are GMOs in all kinds of studies, animals, etc. In medicine, it is used. The genetic engineering technology has been considered by science, by scientists, a very safe technology, and it is used in hundreds of labs every day, and there's never been a problem in the lab. This is not in the lab, this is out in the environment, and this is your food. So this is a different problem. But there are many different kinds of GMOs that have been created, but all of them, except for the bottom one, resistance to a herbicide, all of them are basically not very successful. They're on the shelf, they're in the lab, they haven't been commercialized, they're not successful. The major one is resistance to a herbicide, which is, of course, the Roundup Ready, because Monsanto was the first one to think of it and to develop this line of new crops. And of course, all the other chemical companies now are just avidly after the same invention because they can see that they want their turn. So 1996, we had soybean and corn, and then in the very next few years, we have cotton, canola, sugar beet, alfalfa, sorghum. These Roundup Ready crops have been so successful, the farmers love the technology because it allows, that you can see on the picture, this is corn, this is a field of corn, which is sprayed with glyphosate, with Roundup. It is Roundup Ready. The Monsanto people, technical people, will tell the farmers, don't worry about your weeds, you don't need to think about them, just plant your seeds, your corn seeds. And then when your corn is about this high, then all the weeds have come up, and you get a much better weed management. You spray your weeds when the crop is up. And of course, you spray the crop at the same time. So remember what I said about the residues of glyphosate in the soil. When you use it as a herbicide, there might be a little bit in the plant next season. When you spray the crop right at the beginning of the season, of course, this is a different game. You're going to have a lot more residue of the chemical inside the plant. This is a systemic chemical. It goes into every cell of the plant. So, we've gone from the herbicide in 1974 to the modified crops Roundup Ready in 1996. And a few years later, there's a new technique. There's no patent for it. It's just what the farmers were told they could do. And it was never done before, and now they're doing it very routinely, because this is almost 20 years ago now. What they're doing is they're spraying crops that have not been engineered. Now, if you spray a crop, or any plant for that matter, with a herbicide, you're going to kill it. That's what the herbicide does. It kills plants. So why would farmers spray crops that will be killed? Well, it's really useful at the end of the season for certain crops, like all the grains and all the seed crops, which are not quite mature. So if they're not quite ripe yet, then you can use this chemical to kill the plant, to kill the crop, just before harvest. And then you dry them. You kill the crop before they're dried and they're ripened. So there's no sound to this one. It's just to show you that this is a field of wheat, which will be harvested next week, and it is being sprayed with this chemical, with this herbicide, to ripen it, to make sure that everywhere in the field it is properly ripened, is properly dried. And then, of course, at the same time, you can kill the weeds, the weeds that have come. So, chemical ripening of basically all the grains and the seed crops has become routine. It is normal now. And the benefits of this application just before harvest, you can harvest earlier if you want. You have less moisture in the grain. It is dry. It is ripe. And of course, you have you are controlling your weeds as well. So you can imagine that we've gone from using the chemical as a herbicide, minimum residues in the next crop, to the Roundup Ready crops where you are spraying the crop itself, so there's way more residues, to spraying a crop just before harvest, you get maximum residues of the chemical in the crop, in the food that will be made from the crop. So, for example, if you take a typical meal, at least for teenagers in North America, you can see how contamination comes. There's from GMO corn in the drink. The wheat was desiccated with Roundup. There is the protein filler in the burger is GMO soy, and of course there is the meat, and the animals are fed corn, soy, and wheat. And the potatoes have been desiccated with herbicide, not necessarily Roundup. And of course, the French fries were fried in canola oil, which is a GMO crop. So when you speak of gluten intolerance, is it glyphosate intolerance? And I'm coming to that. This table shows you the maximum residue limit, the tolerance levels. They are usually expressed in parts per million or milligram per kilo. It's the same thing. So you can see, and I'm going to show you the same table with my remarks. You can see in the green column that this is in 1993. This is the residue limit set by the EPA. But they say this is safe. If this much is in your food, it's okay. And you can see that you get 0.1 milligram per kilo in corn, 0.1 milligram per kilo in oats and wheat, and you can see the numbers yourself. I'm not sure why the residue limits in 1993 were so high in soybean. But in 2015, on the right, in the red column, the numbers are much bigger, much higher. You know what happened between 1993 and 2015. We have gone from using the chemical as a herbicide to spraying the crops in 1996, and then now by 2015, of course, for at least 10 to 12 years, we've been using the chemical as a desiccant, as a chemical ripening agent, just before harvest. So of course, the contamination is much higher. And if you look at the column on the right, which is mine, I've just calculated how many times the residue limits were increased. So if you look, for example, for wheat, mid-high, it goes from 0.1 to 30 milligram per kilo. 300 times more residues are allowed in your wheat. So as I say often, you could have a really nice looking loaf of bread in the store with a big non-GMO sticker on it, and it's completely meaningless. The residue limit for it is 300 milligram per kilo in the wheat. So if you're in the store, you need to remember what is contaminated and what is not if you are choosy about your food. As I said, all the grains and seed crops are contaminated heavily because they are sprayed just before harvest. Everything raised or prepared with corn and soy and canola, because they are GMO crops, they are sprayed at the beginning of the season. Everything in the dairy, the meat and eggs, of course, is contaminated because we feed our animals corn, soy, and wheat, which have all been sprayed. Notice that I am not saying anything about fruit and vegetables. Fruit and vegetables cannot be sprayed with Roundup. You can use the Roundup as a herbicide maybe the season before, but you certainly cannot spray fruit trees or a field of carrots or cucumbers, etc. Fruits and vegetables cannot be sprayed with this herbicide, only as a herbicide, the season before. So the residue limits in those items are extremely low. So I have been spending this time explaining to you the history of the chemical and how it is used. And now I'm going to, but I haven't really said much about toxicity. So I'm coming to that. In 2002, the chemical company filed for a patent at the US Bureau of Patent for glyphosate as an antibiotic. Because it's easy to know, it's easy to understand, the plants are killed exactly the same way that the bacteria are killed, and many other organisms that I've shown you. It's the same biochemical pathway in plants and in bacteria that is involved with this chemical. It's called the shikimate pathway, shikimic acid pathway. This is the text of the patent. You can Google the patent just like I did. You Google the patent, you go on Google, patent, glyphosate, herbicide, 2002 Monsanto, you will come to the patent and you will read exactly what I'm putting on the screen here. Somewhere in the patent you will read a list of the susceptible organisms They include basically all bacteria. There are some bacteria that are resistant. And then somewhere else in the patent, you will read that you need about 1 to 2 milligram per kilo of body weight. This is for humans, remember. This is a patent for an antibiotic for humans, but preferably as little as 10 milligram per kilo may be used. Now, this tells you that this is actually a very powerful, a very potent antibiotic. 1 to 2 milligram per kilo is really not a very high dose for an antibiotic. So if you include glyphosate as an antibiotic, and you probably know that you've probably heard that the medical establishment is really concerned that we humans are using way too much antibiotic for ourselves. But look, for sick humans, there's a little sliver, orange. We feed our cattle antibiotics. Cattle, pigs, chickens, all the animals that we raise for foods are fed antibiotics. But that's the yellow part. And the blue part is glyphosate, which is sprayed everywhere in the landscape. And if you think of glyphosate as an antibiotic, which it is, then you come to the problem of antibiotic resistance, because it is for sure, we have known ever since we started using antibiotic, penicillin during World War II, that the more we use antibiotics, the faster bacteria will develop resistance. And we are losing our antibiotics because bacteria are becoming resistant. So this tells you that we use hundreds of tons for medicine, for human medicine. We use thousands of tons to fatten our animals, and we use millions of tons for weed control of antibiotic. And the consequence of that is antibiotic resistance. Video, please.
Back here now, chemicals used in common weed killers could be contributing to the problem of antibiotic resistance. This according to researchers at Canterbury University. Their study released today could have implications worldwide because of the rise of superbugs, for which there are no effective drugs. Jess Cartwright explains.
In the battle with weeds, chemical sprays have long been the weapon of choice. But now there's evidence some of the chemicals in them could be putting human health at risk on a global scale.
If you look at how different commercial chemical products are regulated, almost never is there an assessment on the sublethal effects of these products, particularly on microorganisms.
Groundbreaking research by Canterbury University's discovered some chemicals used in herbicides are playing a role in making bacteria resistant to antibiotics.
This is recent, as you can see. This is from last November, just a few months old. And this has not been repeated, but this is really not very complex science. All you need to put is the antibiotic on petri dishes and see what grows and see what doesn't. So there's no reason to doubt it. Okay, so this is antibiotic resistance, which could be a serious problem, which is a serious problem. But there's another serious problem with having an antibiotic in your food. For those of you who don't know, you have an organ here in the bottom of your belly, a super organ called your colon, your big intestine, that's how it used to be known, which has inside your intestinal flora. That's what my mother used to call it 70 years ago. But now it has a different name. It's called the microbiome. The microbiome is a huge number of bacteria in your colon. There's 100 trillion of them. And that's why here on the video it says you are outnumbered 10 to 1. We humans are made about of 10 trillion cells. And it doesn't matter what the numbers are, but we're definitely outnumbered. And there's 100 trillion bacteria. You have one cell, human cell, for 10 bacterial cells. Of course, the human cells are much bigger. But still, this is a very considerable number of bacteria in our belly. What are they doing there? Why are we carrying this load? It turns out from very recent research, and I can tell you that the number of published papers in the last few years, in the last 5 years, is going logarithmically. It's incredible. The whole medical research establishment is on fire. We are discovering a new super organ. The bacteria are talking to each other in our colon, but they are also talking to all of our organs. The brain, the immune system, the digestive system, etc. They are using small molecules that they manufacture, that they make, to send signals to our organs. You are not in charge of your liver or your kidneys. You don't think about it. There's nothing you can do about it. Somebody else is in charge here. You see the brain here? It says behavior. Now, some of you would be shocked to learn that the bacteria in your belly are actually in charge of your mood. Are you happy? Are you depressed? How is your serotonin level in your brain? 95% of the serotonin in your brain comes from your gut. If you don't have enough serotonin, you're depressed, very depressed, and it can go on from there. And we're also discovering that there are other neurotransmitters that are affected also. The digestive system is home, so of course they're in charge. The immune, I'm not going to talk about your heart, but the immune system is 100% controlled by your microbiome. 100% of your immune cells are taught. The bacteria in your microbiome are the teachers that show your immune cells what to react to and what not to react to. And this explains the allergies and asthma and all kinds of autoimmune disease that we've seen become epidemic in the last 20 years. This is a quick video by a professor from Belgium who is going to explain to you that because the bacteria in our gut are so important, a lot of chronic diseases will come if they are not happy. If your microbiome is not happy, I sometimes use the word joyous, you get sick, okay? You come down with a chronic disease. And you can see here on the right, your other genome. I told you that you are outnumbered. We are outnumbered 1 to 10. We have 10 times more bacterial cells than human cells. But in terms of genes, in terms of genetics, it's way worse than that, or way better. They have 100 times more genes than we do. We have 20,000 genes, and these bacteria in our belly have millions of genes. So I think of you, I think of me as a walking bacterial colony. 1% of our genes in our body are human genes.
Have a second genome active in and on our bodies. And we've learned that you can sort of classify the gut flora into 3 kinds, 3 corners of ecosystem space. And we've called them enterotypes. And so to give you a better feeling what these enterotypes are, I often make the what's the word? The comparison, thank you, with an ecosystem, right? With a forest. You have tropical forests, you have temperate forests, you have bamboo forests. They're all forests, but you have different species living together and functioning as a unit. You have constellations that work optimally, and that's what I think these constellations in your gut flora are like. And so the environment that these bacteria live in, they determine these constellations, it seems. And the environment in the gut is the food that you eat. And so people have discovered that the people that have more fat in their food, or more protein in their food, or more carbohydrate in their food, they have different gut compositions. And that's important, because more and more diseases are linked to disturbances of your gut flora. Diarrhea, diabetes, obesity, arteriosclerosis, colitis, Crohn's disease, even autism, all have been associated with disturbed gut floras. And it's not merely associations. Bad gut floras can actually cause disease.
So I want you to remember this picture here. What he's saying basically is what you put in your mouth is the environment for your microbiome. And what he talked about having more fat or protein, he didn't talk about fiber, plant fibers. That's what they want. The bacteria in your colon, they want plant fibers to ferment. That's their food. Everything else is, you know, the ice cream, everything else is completely ignored. They want plant fibers to ferment. Remember, the fruit and the veggies, which are not contaminated, that's the best food for your microbiome. We know that this chemical, we've known for many years, and this is confirmed, of course, we know for many years that the frogs, which live in water, if you have 2 milligrams per kilo in the water, you kill the frogs. And for the salamanders, it's a little bit higher. Now, if you remember the numbers that I showed you for the residue limits from the EPA, for grains, 300 milligrams per kilo. For soybean, 40 milligrams per kilo. And that goes into your belly when you eat those foods. Oh, and I just recently read a paper, a study, that showed that the MRL, the maximum residue limit set by EPA for water, for humans, is 0.7 milligrams per kilo, per liter. And I just read a study where that was tested on rats, and they get really sick after a few months of drinking this kind of water at 0.7 milligrams per liter. It's actually on the EPA website. If you drink water just above 0.7 milligrams per kilo per liter, you are going to get chronic kidney and liver disease. So, animals do not have the shikimic acid pathway, but all their symbionts do. We are an animal, and our main symbiotic organism are the bacteria in our microbiome. Of course, we are also bacteria and fungi and mites and everything on our body, on our skin, everywhere. But really, the microbiome is the most important part of that. All the other animals, of course, are affected because all animals have a microbiome. All plants have a microbiome. All plants and animals are symbiotic organisms. They live together with bacteria. The bacteria send all kinds of chemical signals to control their organs, just like they do for us. This is from Germany in 2013. This was tested, 1 part per million, 1 milligram per kilo, kills basically most of the bacteria in the gut of poultry. But Salmonella and Clostridia are resistant. And that's very troubling because in Germany, this is why the study was done in Germany here, because they were really concerned, and they had an epidemic of botulism caused by Clostridium botulinum in cattle. In Germany, they don't have GMOs, but they import corn and soy and wheat from North America to feed their animals because they like their meat. And the animals become sick with botulism because there is too much glyphosate in the grain, and that kills the bacteria in the microbiome, notably a species called Enterococcus, which inhibits Clostridium botulinum. And then I found this on the internet, which is from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, and you can see that the curve is going. The green curve is mine, but the blue curve is from the CDC. In 2013, I think it was, or 2014, 2013, 2 scientists in the USA published this paper, basically saying that glyphosate, because it damages the microbiome so much, it basically is responsible for celiac. Another paper, not by those two people, another earlier paper, this is from 1989, showed that glyphosate inactivates the cytochrome P450 enzyme. This is a long name for proteins. They are basically detoxification enzymes. There's 57 of those enzymes in our human body. Most of them are in the liver. Your liver is your detoxification organ because of the enzymes that are there. And glyphosate in the food inactivates those proteins. Glyphosate in the food inactivates your detoxification organ. So if there's anything that's somewhat toxic in your food, bingo, you get sick. Normally, this is taken care of by your liver. And so in the same paper, they show that, yes, of course, it causes, no, that's another paper, sorry, the next one. They show that glyphosate poisons, damages the microbiome, inactivates detoxification enzymes, causes inflammation and oxidative stress. And the consequences are basically most of the chronic diseases that we have seen become epidemic in the West in the last 20 years. A group of researchers in France looked at endocrine disruption. Many chemicals are endocrine disruptors. Many pesticides are endocrine disruptors. And sure enough, glyphosate is definitely an endocrine disruptor. At half a part per million, half a milligram per kilo. Again, remember those MRLs, what's in your food. The same group showed that with rat testicular cells, 1 part per million reduced testosterone by 35%. This has implications for fertility in men and women. And we definitely have seen the fertility in men go down significantly in the last 20 years and more. This is a paper that was published in 2014 by the same group in France. And the reaction to this paper, the reaction to this particular picture was scandalous. I need to explain what happened. They did their study. It's a 2-year study. They used the same rat. They wanted to repeat a study that had been done by Monsanto. Monsanto published a study saying, we fed those rats GMO crops and glyphosate, and after 3 months we couldn't detect anything. They were happy, they were fine, so it's safe. They did a different statistical analysis of the results from Monsanto and thought that after 3 months there was something showing. And so they decided to spend $3 million and do a 2-year-long study of this chemical on the rats. They basically repeated the experiment done by Monsanto using the same strain of rats, which is prone to cancer, but it's a normal thing in the lab. The Dewey strain of rats is used everywhere. And they fed the rats the GMO corn and glyphosate at different levels, and they measured glyphosate levels in the urine, and they measured how the physiology of the animal was every week. There was a large team of toxicologists involved in this study, in this very long study. This is the longest study we've ever done on this chemical. And after 2 years, after 4 months, they could see there was damage to the liver and the kidneys. It was very obvious. And then a few months later, the tumors appeared. And they kept going. They kept the experiment as planned for 2 years. When they published their results, Monsanto knew that this was coming. They basically, and this is documented, we know it happened. This is in the book. If you are interested in the story, the whole story is in the book, which is for sale at this is an excellent book. Monsanto asked 24, I call them academics for hire, to write letters to the publisher, to the editor of the journal, of the scientific journal, to the newspapers, saying this study is terrible, they don't know what they're doing, they don't know how to do statistical analysis, the results are meaningless, this is fraudulent, this is horrible, yeah, this is fraud. And the kind of language that was used is not usual. It's a little bit overdone. That's never been done before. I've never seen that before in my career. And after, let's say, the editor, the publisher said, well, the paper was peer-reviewed. Many scientists looked at the results and approved of it. There's nothing wrong with the study. We keep it. And after about a year, suddenly there was a new editor for biotechnology placed in the paper, somebody who worked for Monsanto. And within a few weeks, decided to retract the paper. Now, retracting a paper is something that happens incredibly rarely. If it is fraudulent science and it was the results were copied or the results were invented or really. But the reason for retracting the paper, and I have often have it as in red letters, was inconclusive results. Well, 90% of all scientific studies have inconclusive results. You have to plan the next paper if you're a scientist and you want to keep your job. You don't want to say, okay, I'm done, I can retire now, I'm only 35, but I don't need my job. No, you plan your job, you plan your studies. So, of course, everything is measured and inconclusive until the end. So inconclusive results really doesn't wash at all. The paper was retracted formally and peer-reviewed again and republished in another journal in 2014. So it is available. You can look at it if you want. There have been many studies done with the chemical showing that there is oxidative stress. Oxidative stress is a sign of cancer. And that many studies show oxidative stress. This study here is from Bangkok University, and they show that cancer cell proliferation, this is human breast cancer cells, was accelerated. They grew much faster when the chemical was included. So much so that in 2015, the World Health Organization, which is like the largest, the top authority for health, for chemical in the world. And every year they assemble a team of toxicologists to look at a few chemicals. And in 2015, they recruited 17 scientists, the top toxicologists in the world, from 11 countries, and they put them together in a room and asked them to review the literature on this chemical, on glyphosate and a few others. And these people, these scientists, concluded that there was no way that glyphosate could be non-carcinogenic. They classified it as a probable human carcinogen. Well, this was another scandal because Monsanto just did the same thing again. They have a few scientists for hire, academics for hire, and they raised a lot of noise against the World Health Organization, which has never been done before, and basically said, you're completely out of it, you are activists, you are part of the conspiracy. In the brouhaha, it came out that in 1985, the EPA toxicologists had already classified glyphosate as a probable carcinogen. But their decision was reversed. The EPA reversed their decision in 1991 and decided that it was not carcinogenic over the objections of the toxicologists of the EPA. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, in 2017, the EPA declared that glyphosate is not a human carcinogen, contradicting the World Health Organization. I'm going to show you a 2-minute video of Professor Portier, who was one of the consultants on the video, please, consultant on this decision.
In cancer, we have what we call the 10 key characteristics of human carcinogenesis. And these are the 10 key things that we believe chemicals and environmental factors and agents in the environment do to start the cancer process So oxidative stress is a potential precursor for cancer, and seeing study after study where glyphosate induces oxidative stress suggests that that could strengthen the overall cancer finding.
All of the evidence is rejected by BFR. Chris Portier encountered a similar neglect in the USA.
EPA reviewed the same animal evidence as us, initially concluding there was evidence of carcinogenicity from that animal evidence. They presented that finding to their science advisory panel, which is an outside panel of scientists, who then felt that that was too strong of a statement and wanted the EPA to reevaluate it again. And in the end, EPA chose to discard those studies as being not relevant and listed as suggestive of no evidence of cancer, which we would definitely, I personally would very much disagree on.
In reality, the BFR assessment had been pre-formulated by the glyphosate task force of the industry. The BFR simply shortened or added comments in italics. Critical studies get rated as not reliable.
So that is another scandal. Another paper which was published in 2014 is a statistical analysis of two bodies of data. You can take two large bodies of data and see if they are linked. Is there one that's kind of come with the other, so to speak? Is there a linkage? It's called a correlation analysis, as you can see on the top. This paper shows that the correlation analysis, the two bodies of data came from the CDC, the U.S. Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, and from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The CDC provided the yellow bars. This is the number of people who come down with a disease. If you are in the USA and you are diagnosed with cancer, autism, liver disease or something, you become a statistic and you are in the CDC. The yellow, so the yellow bars are basically the number of people who come down with some particular disease that I'm going to show you in the next slide. And the red line is the amount of Roundup, of glyphosate that was sprayed on soybean that particular year. So you can see that before the GMO crop in 1996, there is really very little glyphosate that is used. It is only used as a herbicide. It is a successful herbicide, but it is only used as a herbicide to kill the weeds before you plant. After 1996, as you can see, it's going up, 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 because now it is sprayed on the crops, on the GMO crops to start with, and then after that on the grain and seed crops as a chemical ripening agent. And you can see that she did the study from 1990 to 2010. And so how is the linkage? Well, the linkage, the strength of the linkage is shown in the R value. Oops. In the R value, which is called the correlation coefficient. And the correlation coefficient can come to almost to 1, 0.99, which tells you that the linkage is almost perfect. They are definitely coming together. And 0.99 is very high, 0.9 is high, 0.95 is also significant, and 0.99, of course, is almost as high as can go. And so this is what she saw. When she put the two body of data together for glyphosate and liver or kidney cancer, the correlation coefficient was 0.96. For bladder cancer, 0.98, and then you can read the numbers yourself. So this is for cancer, a few cancer. There are many other results in her study. I'm just showing you a few. For other diseases as well, from 1990 to 2010, autism, 0.99, Alzheimer, 0.99, celiac, 0.98. Even diabetes, obesity are also extremely highly linked to the use of glyphosate and to the amount of glyphosate in the food. Okay, so we're coming to the end. I just have a few more slides. I've talked about all this But I haven't talked about the top one, 1950, a synthetic amino acid. And glyphosate is a synthetic amino acid. It is what is called a glycine analog. And I'm going to show you that. You know, you remember your grade 8 biology, you remember all the amino acids. There will be a test at the end. The smallest amino acid has 2 carbon. It's a very tiny molecule. It's called glycine. 2 carbon, and of course, because it is an amino acid, it has 2 arms, 1 amino end and 1 carbo acid end, and that's how they join. And that's how you make your proteins. And glyphosate is glycine methylphosphonate, glyphosate. An amino acid analog is glycine with a methyl residue and phosphonic acid tail. So it's basically a small amino acid with a little tail. And there are huge consequences to that. These 2 scientists have published this paper. This is in 2015, I believe 2016. So this is hardly 2 years old. And they published this paper, and they really went into the literature to see, well, if it is an amino acid analog, what can we expect? And it's very obvious, and I don't know if you can read the small print, but I've enlarged it, and I'm going to give you a minute to read it, because it's really significant. Basically, if it is an amino acid analog, it can be inserted into the proteins instead of glycine. So the amino acids are inserted into the proteins, into the cells, by the molecular machinery, and it is not capable, the machinery is not capable of distinguishing between the glycine and the glycine methylphosphonate, the glycine with a small tail. So glyphosate is introduced into the protein. And that's, again, the abstract from the same paper. But if you start at the bottom, it says, where did it? Oh, no, it's glyphosate substitution, etc. Explain diabetes, obesity, asthma, chronic. I mean, the list is very long. You can take pictures if you want. But you will be able to see this because there's a video being made of this lecture. So it will be on YouTube, and you will be able to come back to that. Another, this is the same scientist, Anthony Samzel, who's really doing a lot of wonderful work on this molecule. And he is in touch with me by email, and he has given me permission to show you some of his emails. He was able to, through contact with his senator, I believe, he was able to get 10,000 pages of Monsanto's studies. And so he's going through that, and he's looking at what they did, and he's looking at the results they obtained, and where they went wrong. And he shows, for example, that they knew that glyphosate is incorporated into the protein. They did the experiment with a fish. You can see at the bottom here in the bluegill sunfish tissue, the radioactive carbon glyphosate. They introduce radioactive carbon glyphosate into the feed of the fish. And then the glyphosate is incorporated into the proteins of the fish. And you can measure it because it is radioactive. And that's the experiment. And that shows that Monsanto knew that glyphosate is incorporated into the protein instead of glycine, at least in fish. I showed a horror picture in the lecture 2 days ago, but I thought maybe it was a bit too much, so I'm not showing it tonight. But it was about a group of women in the USA in 2013 who were concerned that they were breastfeeding, and they wanted to know whether glyphosate could go from the food that they were eating into their breast milk. And so they had their breast milk analyzed for glyphosate residues, and they were horrified to discover that practically all of them had glyphosate residues in their breast milk, and that's what they were feeding their babies. So of course they got totally upset, went to the EPA, and the EPA said, oh, don't worry, it's fine. The levels are so low, it's not going to do anything, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And besides, it's not really possible. There must be some mistake. And Monsanto published a paper this year or last year, and the first author is somebody I know well from the University of California who works for Monsanto, saying that, oh, we measured and we looked hard for residues of glyphosate in breast milk, and we didn't find any. And Anthony Samzel, the scientist who's in touch with me, is very, very clear that glyphosate becomes part of the proteins of all milk. And it doesn't matter what kind of animal you are, if it's in cow's milk or human milk or any kind of mammal will have glyphosate in their milk. This is confirmed by a study done in Germany where they measured the glyphosate to see if there was glyphosate in organs of cattle and humans, and basically they found glyphosate in all the organs that were measured. I also showed 2 slides 2 days ago which show that the University of California has done a study where they sampled 1,000 people, and they were planning to do more, so I don't know if they're doing more. This is very recent. This is from last year. And out of 1,000 people in California where they measured the level of contamination in their body, 93% of people were contaminated. In Germany, another study, the same kind of study, 99% of people were shown to be contaminated, to have glyphosate in the organs in their body. This is the book that I'm recommending to you. I read it. I think it's really well done. Carrie Gillam is a really serious investigative journalist. She writes in the book, in the first pages, that when the technology began, she was completely enthused about it. She was really hopeful, and that it was great. It would increase food, yield of food, etc., etc. And she was totally an ally of Monsanto, and she was in the Monsanto headquarters all the time, asking questions, writing about it, and totally positive. And then she kind of started noticing things and started asking questions and started asking the wrong questions. And they basically told her not to pay attention to this and not to pay attention to that. But she's an investigative journalist and she does pay attention. And so promptly she realized that she was being led the wrong path, and she investigated some more. Suddenly she became their enemy. They tried to destroy her, had her fired from Reuters, etc., etc. She wrote the book. The book came out last November. It's very fresh. Okay, I'm just going to show you 2 more. This is me speaking, in not this person, of course, but the next one. I'm being interviewed here. And I just said a few things which I think I like the way I said them. It's concise. And instead of repeating myself, I'm just going to show you the video, please.
In the European Union, they were looking seriously at withdrawing the license from glyphosate. Mm-hmm. They decided not to, but the French government, and I believe the Belgian government, says they're going to persist anyway with their own. So there you've got a whole government that thinks it's dangerous enough to merit withdrawing a license to use it. Does that have merit as an approach?
Yes, the reason why I'm public about it is because I'm really concerned about the food contamination.
Yes.
So obviously the next move is to regulate the hell out of this chemical and ban it to be used on food crops, for God's sake.
Yes.
It shouldn't be done.
Right.
To use it as a herbicide when it's such a good herbicide, probably no more toxic than many others, maybe. So that's my position. But I can't imagine a Minister of Agriculture deciding from one day to the next, sorry, to the farming community, you can't use this chemical anymore. They are going to go crazy. They are completely addicted. The technology has been so incredibly successful in the last 20, 25 years that basically the farmers cannot even imagine that they could farm differently. It used to be that they had a herbicide and they would spray the herbicide on the weeds and then plant their seeds, and there might be some weeds coming up again, and that's how it was. And now, of course, now that they can spray the crops, there is no more weeds, and they take pride in having absolutely no weeds in their fields because they have been told repeatedly for 25 years that this chemical is absolutely safe, innocuous, there's absolutely no danger. You can use it as often as you want, as much as you want, it doesn't matter. And that's what they're used to. And that's what I mean when I say they're completely addicted. And my feeling is that there is so much, 5, 6 years ago when I started speaking publicly, nobody was talking about this chemical. It was all about GMOs. Everybody is afraid of GMOs. And I'm happy to report that now, at last, people are trying to are coming to pay attention to the chemical, not so much to the technology. So, this said, even if this chemical is banned or regulated, as I say, the next one is already authorized. So the next one is already in line. This is chemical agriculture. Industrial agriculture relies on this technology being able to spray the food crops with a chemical, because that's what they do, that's what they know how to do, and they don't want to change anything. Probably because maybe the farmers might make less money, or the corporation might make less money. I'm not sure exactly what the numbers are. But as I say, you probably know, or maybe you don't, but Bayer is buying Monsanto, and the merger is now formal and authorized as of this week. The Department of Justice in the USA has agreed. It's going. Well, Bayer comes with their own chemical. It's called glyphosate. And the name is almost the same, isn't it? Because it is almost the same molecule. The molecule is in the middle here, and it's glyphosate. It is an antibiotic. It is not a synthetic antibiotic. It is a natural antibiotic. It is produced by several species of bacteria in the soil. But it is an antibiotic. That's what bacteria make, to kind of keep other species at bay. And it is also a glutamate, which is glutamic acid. It's an amino acid. It's another amino acid analog. And so you can expect that it will have the same problems as glyphosate does if glyphosate becomes the chemical of choice in North America. There is Enlist Duo, which has been registered 2 years ago. It's now allowed by EPA. When there is so many super weeds, there are so many weeds that are now resistant to glyphosate, then what to do? Well, why don't you mix another herbicide with your glyphosate, and the other herbicide will kill the resistant weeds? Everybody's happy, except you're putting twice as much herbicide, aren't you? Twice as much residues. And the other herbicide in this mix is 2,4-D. And some of you look old enough to remember the Vietnam War. 2,4-D was part of the mix in Agent Orange. And I'm going to give the last words to Dr. Seneff, who is from MIT. Thank you.
New world order. So I think this might, I feel this is like the turning point. I can hope that enough people will start to become informed, and people will start to realize that this is not sustainable agriculture. The path we are on is destructive. We have to change the way we grow food if we're going to not end up having every well person in the world spending all of their time taking care of the people who are sick and needy. I mean, we have to do something different.
Okay, that's the end of my lecture. Thank you.
This is the second time I've heard this talk. I heard it earlier in the week. And the questions that I asked Dr. Vrain after his talk on Tuesday, he addressed in this talk. so I have to come up with new questions. But one of the things that was a little confusing to me, because I had not done a lot of reading about GMO foods in general before, and it sounds like from the way you present it that GMO foods equals food that has had that's glyphosate ready. Is that correct?
I would say that over 90% of all GMO crops are Roundup ready. Okay. We are growing about 500 million acres of GMO crops on the planet today, and 90% of that, my guesstimate, of course, is Roundup ready. There's a little bit from Bayer, there's a little bit from here, and there's a few other crops that are not sprayed with Roundup, but really, the overwhelming majority is Roundup ready, is sprayed with Roundup.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then with the breastfeeding study, so that when you go on the web and start reading about glyphosate, you instantly run into a lot of controversy, obviously. And there's a breastfeeding study that the moms did where they found glyphosate in breast milk. And then you mentioned the California study, or the one here in the U.S. where the levels were also found. Then there's the one in Germany where they had breast milk samples from the Bavarian region of Germany, and it was funded by the risk assessment group in Germany that didn't find any glyphosate. Are you familiar with that study?
No, I'm not.
Okay. It was, and then the more I read, it was the risk assessment group is being funded by, some questionable sources, and so it's really hard to tell.
I will admit that I tend to be biased. I'm serious. It's not a joke. I tend to be biased because in the last 5 or 6 or more years that I've looked at this problem, I've noticed, and I say it in my TED talk, that there's, everybody thinks of the science, right? And that's why the title of the book is called The Corruption of Science. So you think of science. Well, today there's 2 kinds of science. There's corporate science, and there is science done in universities and independent science. And the 2 seem to show different results most of the time. So, as I said, I tend to be biased, and I give more weight to the independent studies than to the corporate studies.
Yes, and that's another thing that I have found. Once I realized you were coming, I started digging into the literature more on glyphosate and was really amazed at the difference between, the number of industry-funded studies, which is really unusual for the substances that I spend a lot of time with in my job as an occupational environmental medicine physician, looking up substances and their effects on human health. I've never seen a chemical with so many studies funded by industry or consultants. It doesn't always come right out and say what the company is, but with consultants that are industry-based. And then the whole group of researchers from the university setting that had opposite findings from the industry studies. It's really dramatic with this chemical, and it shows me how desperate Monsanto must be feeling that this herbicide, which is now the most commonly used herbicide on the planet, over 50% of all the herbicides are glyphosate produced by Monsanto, how desperate they must be feeling and threatened by these studies that show potential human health effects.
I don't know that I would use the word desperate. They've done this forever. They did it with many other chemicals. I mean, they're basically following they doing the same thing that the tobacco companies did 50 years ago. Tobacco companies came up with all kinds of studies showing that smoking cigarettes has absolutely no consequences health-wise.
Okay, I'm going to take some questions from the audience now, and this is one that came up the other night too, so I'm going to be sure that you address it. Is glyphosate in Roundup okay to use on the weeds on your lawn, as long as you're not using it in your food? Oh, he's going for the readers now. Oh, lots of questions.
I can't see, I can't hear, but I'm still kicking. Glyphosate in Roundup. Is glyphosate in Roundup safe to use to kill the weeds on our lawn, but not to use glyphosate to grow food? Oh, please.
I want to hear what you have to say to this one.
This tells you really how invasive it is in our society. Everybody uses it. If you spray your lawn, probably your pets or your kids are going to go in there and, lick their paws, etc., etc. So that's not a good thing. Should you use it on your food crop? I would say no. Please, don't. Not a good idea. I'm a gardener. I have a large garden. I really enjoy gardening. This is really it's a good thing to do, to be in the garden. And the weeds are overwhelming, basically the same thing as in the fields. And I really wish there was a chemical that I could use and spray in my garden that would get rid of the weeds, but not glyphosate.
Here's a question that asks, there are a couple questions about what are the ways to remove glyphosate from our body, particularly our organs. And what I found in looking up this substance and its effects on the human body is how little there is out there. Normally, when I'm looking into a chemical that is produced and regulated by the EPA, that's synthetic and regulated by the EPA, there is some level of study showing how long it lasts in the human body, where it's stored in the human body, and I'm amazed at how little there is out there. As far as I know, after spending some time diving into the scientific literature on this, on human health, we don't know how long glyphosate lasts in the body. We don't know specifically what organs it's stored in. And that being said, I don't know of any way to remove glyphosate from the body. It's possible that it only stays, some chemicals only stay for less than a day, and then you pee them out. Or are you shaking your head? No? No? Oh, okay. So I'm shaking your head. I thought, maybe somebody knows how long it's stored in the body. But no, I don't know of any ways to remove glyphosate from the human body.
No, we don't have that information. All we have is anecdotal evidence. People come to their doctor and say, with symptoms, and doctor think, maybe you should go organic, eat 100% organic for 3 months, and come and see me again. And oftentimes, the symptoms either disappear or are much better, etc., etc. But we really don't have that information.
That's another question that was asked several times. Are organic foods truly glyphosate-free?
No. Organic food is your best bet. Organic food, by definition, cannot be sprayed with glyphosate or many other synthetic chemicals, as you know. Even if you're questioning the organic standards, etc., it's still your best bet. It's mine. Anyway, except, as you heard me say, glyphosate is everywhere. It's in the water, in the air, in the soil. So it's basically impossible for organic growers to guarantee that there is absolutely no glyphosate at all in their food, in their crop. Of course, the residues will be incredibly small compared to what I've shown you. So this is reality. This is our reality. The next best thing is to grow your own food. If you have a garden, make sure you become passionate about it.
Why are fruits and vegetables not affected by glyphosate?
Why?
Fruits and vegetables. You mentioned that fruits and vegetables aren't sprayed. I will say before you answer that fruits and vegetables can have a lot of other pesticides on them.
Fruit and vegetables are sprayed with all kinds of insecticides. Apples are sprayed with fungicides almost every week for the whole season. It's a horrible picture. But fruit and vegetables, by definition, cannot be sprayed with glyphosate because otherwise you kill the crop. That's what the herbicides do. As I explained, you cannot spray a field of carrots with glyphosate. You're going to, so of course that's not what you want. You don't want limp vegetables in the store. So fruit and vegetables may have very small residues of glyphosate if it was used as a herbicide, like I showed you in the video in Germany. So if it's used as a herbicide in the fall to really clean up the field
Before planting.
before planting, and then you grow your crop, there will be minimal residues in the crop. So yes, fruits and vegetables could have minimal residues.
So
but
what
compared to the GMO crop and the chemical ripening crops, there's
So
no
there
comparison.
aren't GMO carrots.
No.
They're mostly
The
they're
GMO
grains,
crops are
sugar
soy,
beets.
soybean, corn, canola, and there's only a half dozen of them.
Yeah. I'm going to do two more questions, and then we'll finish up. I can answer this first one. In 2015, the WHO classified glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. You mentioned that in your talk, but in 2017, it was declared as not a human carcinogen. Can you explain this change? So Dr. Vrain did explain in his talk that the WHO, the part of the WHO, the International Agency on Research on Cancer, IARC, concluded that glyphosate is a probable carcinogen. The EPA, since then, has stated that glyphosate is, they say it's not a human carcinogen. So those two entities disagree. The WHO is sticking with its decision. It hasn't retracted its decision.
And that's the same point that I made before about science. There's corporate science and independent science. Of course, the WHO experts would know really instantly what comes from the corporations and may or may not be so reliable. So, of course, they relied much more on independent science. Mm-hmm. And therefore, you have two different opinions.
One last question. Here, I'll let you read that one.
Thank you.
It's about soil. And since you're a soil biologist, you're probably
Since glyphosate is an antibiotic, what are the consequences of killing the microbiome of the soil? There's no such thing as the microbiome of the soil. There's microbiome in plants. The microbiome is symbiotic bacteria that are in the root zone, that are associated in the roots of the plants. So spraying antibiotic constantly, year after year after year in your fields, is not going to be good for the life of the soil. Again, in this particular instance, there's corporate science, which will tell you that, oh yeah, we looked really hard and the earthworms are happy, everything is fine. And then there's independent science that says, whoa, they're really taking a hit. The earthworms are really taking a hit. And we're measuring the bacteria, and yes, they're there, but they're doing something really weird. They're making proteins, and they're destroying them, and they're making them again, and because of what I just explained. And so, yes, of course, there is a huge impact on the soil, on the life of the soil, which is a very important problem because basically it leads to desertification. If you eliminate the life of the soil, and there is more life, if you don't know that, there is more life in the soil, more carbon in the soil than above ground. When you look above ground and you see all the trees and the birds and you think this is it, there's a lot more in the soil that's feeding the plants, etc. So if you're spraying antibiotics, of course you're affecting the life of the soil.
Thank you very much. There's one question about Samsel and Senef that I'd be happy to address afterwards. I think it might be beyond the scope of the audience's interest. But let's stop here. It's 8:30. If you have additional questions, please come up and see us afterwards. Thank you so much, Dr. Vrain, for making the trip.
Thank you.